I'm a single mom with 2 kids, Melina, who's 8, and Dustin, who's 5. After my divorce 2 years ago, I moved us into a small house I was renting in a quiet residential neighborhood in Colorado. It's the kind of place where kids ride bikes in the street and neighbors know each other's names. I thought it would be the perfect place to start over and give my kids some stability. The house sits on a corner lot, which I initially liked because it meant we had a bigger yard and lots of natural light. What I didn't consider at the time was how exposed that made us, with windows facing 2 different streets and no houses directly next to us on 2 sides. I work as a nurse at the local hospital, doing mostly day shifts, which meant I was usually home with the kids in the evenings and could maintain a somewhat normal routine for them. After the chaos of the divorce, routine was exactly what we all needed. This all started on a Saturday night in late September. The kids and I had spent the day at a local festival, and they were exhausted by the time we got home around 7 p.m. I made them a quick dinner, got them bathed, and had them in bed by 8:30, which was earlier than usual, but they were practically falling asleep at the dinner table. I was looking forward to having some quiet time to catch up on laundry and maybe watch something on Netflix. I poured myself a glass of wine and was folding clothes in the living room when I heard a sound that made me pause. It was a tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch hitting the house in the wind, but when I listened more carefully, I realized it was too regular, too intentional. I muted the TV and walked to the front window to look out. Our street was quiet, with just a few porch lights on and no movement that I could see. The tapping had stopped, so I went back to folding laundry, thinking maybe it had been a neighbor doing some late-night yard work. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again, but this time it was coming from a different direction. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the house where Melina's bedroom window was located. The tapping pattern was the same. 3 quick taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I grabbed my phone and quietly walked down the hallway toward the kids' bedrooms. Both Melina and Dustin were sound asleep, but I could definitely hear the tapping more clearly from Melina's room. It was coming from right outside her window. I carefully looked out Melina's window, moving the curtain just slightly so I wouldn't be seen if someone was looking up. The side yard was darker than the front, with only distant streetlight providing any illumination. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed a shadow near the fence that seemed too tall and too still to be natural. As I watched, the shadow moved. Someone was definitely standing in our side yard, and they were close enough to our house that they could have been touching Melina's window. I immediately called 911, whispering so I wouldn't wake the kids or alert whoever was outside. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, the tapping stopped. I stayed on the line and kept watch from Melina's window until the police arrived about 6 minutes later. The officers searched our yard and the surrounding area, but didn't find anyone. However, they did find evidence that someone had been there. There were fresh footprints in the soft dirt under Melina's window, and some of the decorative rocks I had arranged along the flower bed had been disturbed, like someone had been kicking them or moving them around. One of the officers, a woman named Officer Martinez, was particularly concerned because the footprints were right up against the house, directly under my daughter's bedroom window. She suggested I consider getting motion-activated lights for the yard and maybe a security system if I could afford it. I spent the rest of that night checking and rechecking all the locks, and I barely slept. Every sound had me jumping up to look out windows. I kept thinking about someone standing outside my 8-year-old daughter's bedroom in the dark, tapping on the house like they were trying to get her attention. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought motion-activated floodlights for both sides of the house. I couldn't afford a professional security system, but I got some of those battery-powered motion sensors that would sound an alarm if someone came too close to the windows. For about a week, everything was quiet. The motion lights didn't go off except when neighborhood cats wandered through the yard, and I started to think maybe it had been a one-time incident. Maybe someone had been drunk or confused and wandered into our yard by mistake. But then it happened again, and this time it was much worse. I was working a late shift at the hospital and didn't get home until almost midnight. The kids were staying overnight at my mom's house, which was something we did occasionally when my schedule didn't line up well with theirs. I was actually grateful they weren't home that night, because what happened would have terrified them. I pulled into my driveway and immediately noticed that one of my new motion lights was out. The bulb had been working fine when I left for work, and it was too new to have burned out already. As I got closer to the house, I could see that the light fixture had been damaged. Someone had thrown something at it hard enough to break both the bulb and crack the plastic housing. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I could drive to my mom's house and spend the night there, but I didn't want to scare her or the kids. I could call the police, but technically nothing had happened yet except a broken light, which could have been vandalism or an accident. I decided to go inside, but stay alert. I parked right up close to the front door, left my car unlocked in case I needed to get back to it quickly, and kept my phone in my hand as I unlocked the house. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on immediately, but something was off. I turned on lights as I moved through each room, checking to make sure everything was normal. In the kitchen, I found the first clear sign that someone had been inside my house. The back door, which I always kept locked, was standing wide open, not just unlocked, but actually open about 6 inches, letting in the cool night air. I knew with absolute certainty that I had locked that door before leaving for work. I immediately called 911 and ran back to my car to wait for the police. While I was waiting, I called my mom to make sure the kids were okay and to tell her what was happening. She wanted to come over, but I told her to stay with Melina and Dustin and keep the doors locked until I knew what was going on. When the police arrived, they did a thorough search of the house. They found that whoever had been inside hadn't taken anything obvious, but they had definitely been exploring. Drawers in my bedroom had been opened and gone through, though nothing seemed to be missing. More disturbingly, they had spent time in Melina's room. Her closet door was open, and some of her stuffed animals had been moved around on her bed. Her dresser drawers were slightly open, like someone had been looking through her clothes. The police officer told me this was consistent with what they called predatory behavior, where someone breaks into a house not to steal, but to learn about the occupants, especially children. I found that the intruder had gotten in through a window in my laundry room that I hadn't secured properly. It was one of those older windows with a simple latch, and it had been easy to open from the outside, so they'd probably watched the house long enough to know that I worked late shifts and the kids were sometimes gone overnight. The police arranged for extra patrols in my neighborhood, and I spent that night at my mom's house. The next day, I had a security system installed with cameras, door and window sensors, and a panic button. I also had new locks put on all the doors and security bars installed on the ground floor windows. But even with all those precautions, I never felt safe in that house again. The thought that someone had been inside, going through my children's belongings, touching their things, was more than I could handle. We moved out 6 weeks later. I later found out from Officer Martinez that there had been 3 other break-ins in the neighborhood over the previous 2 months, all involving houses with single mothers and young children. The intruder was never caught, but the break-in stopped after we moved, and the other families in the area increased their security measures. The experience taught me that predators often target single mothers because they assume we're more vulnerable and less likely to fight back. They watch our routines, learn when we're home alone or when our children are unsupervised, and they use that information to plan their attacks. What still haunts me most is not knowing how long that person had been watching us. The tapping on Melina's window that first night might not have been the beginning. They might have been studying our family for weeks or even months before they felt confident enough to actually enter our home. I've made sure Melina and Dustin understand basic safety rules now, like never opening doors for strangers and always telling me if they see anyone around our house who doesn't belong there. It's a sad reality, that I have to teach my children to be afraid, but it's better than the alternative. The new house we live in now has much better security, and we've never had any incidents. But I still check every lock twice before bed, and I still get nervous when I have to work late shifts. Some experiences change you permanently, and this was definitely one of them. This happened to my girlfriend Kinsey and me about 3 years ago. We'd been living together for about 6 months in a small apartment complex in suburban Michigan. It was one of those places with maybe 20 units, 2 stories, arranged in a U shape around a central parking lot. Our apartment was on the ground floor, Unit 1B, right near the entrance to the complex. Kinsey worked as a veterinary technician at an animal hospital, which meant she often worked late when they had emergency surgeries or sick animals that needed monitoring overnight. I was finishing my master's degree in engineering and doing freelance web design to pay the bills, so I spent most of my time at home working on my laptop. The incident started on a Wednesday evening in February. Kinsey had called around 8 p.m. to say she'd be staying late to help with a dog that had been hit by a car. I was used to this, so I just made myself dinner and settled in to work on a client's website. Around 10 p.m., I heard someone knocking on our door. Not unusual, since we'd recently moved in and occasionally got mail delivered to our door by mistake, or neighbors asking about parking spaces. I looked through the peephole but didn't see anyone, which I thought was weird. I opened the door with the chain still attached and called out, "Hello?" There was no response, but I could hear footsteps moving away from the door, heading toward the parking lot. I figured maybe someone had knocked on the wrong door and left when they realized their mistake. About an hour later, it happened again. Same pattern, knocking on the door, but when I looked through the peephole, nobody was there. This time, I opened the door fully and stepped outside to look around. The parking lot was well lit, and I could see all the way to the street, but there was nobody around. I called Kinsey to tell her about it, but she was in the middle of surgery and couldn't talk long. She suggested maybe it was kids playing pranks, since there were several families with teenagers in the complex. The knocking happened 3 more times that night, always when I was alone, always with nobody visible when I checked. By the time Kinsey got home around 2 a.m., I was pretty rattled. She thought I was overreacting, and honestly, I was starting to wonder if maybe I was just being paranoid. The next evening, Kinsey was home with me, and we were watching Netflix when the knocking started again. This time, we both heard it clearly. Kinsey went to look through the peephole while I muted the TV. She turned back to me with a confused expression and whispered that she couldn't see anyone either. We decided to be strategic about it. Kinsey stayed by the peephole while I quietly went to our bedroom window, which had a view of the area right in front of our door. He carefully moved the curtain aside and looked out. Thus when I saw him. There was a man crouched down below the level of the peephole, pressed against our door. He was wearing all dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He'd been knocking, then immediately ducking down so we couldn't see him when we looked through the peephole. I quickly moved away from the window and whispered to Kinsey what I'd seen. She immediately called 911 while I kept watch from the bedroom. The man stayed there for another few minutes, occasionally standing up to knock again, then crouching back down. When the police arrived, about 8 minutes later, the man was gone. The officers took a report and said they'd increased patrols in the area, but without a clear description or any evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. We thought that might be the end of it, but we were wrong. The next night, Friday, the knocking started again around 9 p.m., but this time, it wasn't just knocking. You could hear someone trying the door handle, jiggling it up and down like they were testing to see if it was locked. Then we heard the distinct sound of someone walking around the outside of our apartment, testing windows. I called the police again while Kinsey grabbed a kitchen knife, and we locked ourselves in the bathroom, which was the only room in the apartment without windows. We stayed there until the police arrived, but once again, the person was gone by the time they got there. This time, however, the officers found evidence. There were fresh shoe prints in the dirt below our bedroom window. scratch marks around the window frame, like someone had been trying to pry it open. They also found that our screen door had been damaged, with what looked like knife marks in the mesh. The officers were much more concerned now. They suggested we stayed somewhere else for a few days while they investigated, but we didn't really have anywhere to go, and we couldn't afford a hotel. Instead, we decided to set up our own surveillance. I borrowed a small video camera from a friend in my program, and we positioned it inside our bedroom window, pointing out toward the door area. We also moved furniture against the door and made sure all the windows were securely locked. Saturday night, nothing happened. We were starting to hope that maybe the increased police presence had scared the person off. But Sunday night, around midnight, we heard a new sound that made our hearts stop. Someone was on our roof. We could hear footsteps directly above us, moving slowly from one end of the apartment to the other. Our upstairs neighbors, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, were definitely asleep by that time. And besides, this sounded like someone trying to be quiet, not just normal walking around. The footsteps stopped right above our bedroom. Then we heard a scraping sound, like someone was trying to remove something from the roof. A few minutes later, we realized what was happening. They were trying to access our apartment through the bathroom exhaust fan. I called 911 again, but this time I also called our upstairs neighbors. Mr. Henderson answered on the third ring, groggy but alert when I explained what was happening. I said he'd look out his window and see if he could spot anyone on the roof. 2 minutes later, he called back. There was definitely someone on the roof, dressed in dark clothing, working on something near what he thought was our bathroom vent. He'd called out to them, and they'd immediately started climbing down the back of the building. When the police arrived this time, they found that someone had indeed been trying to remove our bathroom exhaust fan from the outside. They'd managed to loosen several screws and had bent the housing enough that they probably could have gotten it off with a few more minutes of work. The officers were now treating this as a serious attempted breaking and entering case. They processed the scene for fingerprints and footprints, and they stationed a patrol car in our parking lot for the next several nights. We never found out who it was or why they were targeting our specific apartment. The police theory was that it might have been someone who'd seen Kinsey's schedule and knew when she worked late, thinking the apartment would be empty. Or it could have been someone who'd been watching the complex and picked our apartment because it was near the entrance and had good cover from the surrounding trees. We moved out at the end of that month. The whole experience had made us realize how vulnerable we were in a ground floor apartment and how determined some criminals can be when they set their sights on a target. The scariest part wasn't even the attempted break-in itself. It was the realization that someone had been watching us, learning our routines, and planning their approach for days or maybe even weeks. They knew when we were home, when we were alone, and they'd figured out the layout of our apartment well enough to know where the bathroom vent was located. We later learned from the police that this kind of systematic stalking behavior often escalates. If we hadn't been alert and called for help each time, there's a good chance this person would have eventually succeeded in getting inside. The thought of what might have happened then still gives me nightmares. My name is Sean, and I work the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix. The pay isn't great, but working nights meant I could avoid the scorching Arizona heat and pick up extra tips from drunk college kids buying energy drinks and cigarettes. I'd been doing this job for about 8 months when this incident happened. I live in a small rental house about 15 minutes from the gas station. It's one of those older neighborhoods where the houses are spread apart with large desert lots between them. My nearest neighbor is probably 100 yards away, which I always liked because it meant privacy and quiet during the day when I needed to sleep. This particular night in late October, I got home around 7 a.m. after an especially busy shift. Halloween was approaching, and people had been coming in all night buying decorations and candy. I was exhausted and looking forward to crashing until my next shift started at 11 p.m. I parked in my driveway, grabbed my work bag, and headed for the front door. That's when I noticed something odd. There were muddy footprints on my front porch that definitely weren't mine. They were large, probably a size 12 or 13 boot, and they led right up to my front door before stopping. I examined them more closely. The mud looked fresh, and there had been a brief rainstorm the night before. But what really unsettled me was the pattern. The footprints didn't just walk up to the door and leave. They paced back and forth across the width of my porch multiple times, like someone had been standing there for a while, maybe waiting or watching. I unlocked my door and went inside, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I double-checked that all my windows and doors were locked, then tried to get some sleep. Okay, but every little sound made me jump. It's a house settling, the AC kicking on. Even the neighbor's dog barking in the distance had me on edge. Around noon, I was finally starting to drift off when I heard something that made my heart pound. It was the distinct sound of footsteps on gravel. My driveway is made of loose desert rock, and it makes a very specific crunching sound when someone walks on it. I got up and carefully looked out my bedroom window, which faces the front of the house. There was nobody there, but I could see fresh tire tracks in my driveway that hadn't been there when I got home. Someone had driven up my driveway and parked, probably while I was trying to sleep. I called the police, but they said, without seeing an actual person or evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I install security cameras, which I couldn't afford on my gas station salary. The next few days passed without incident, and I started to think maybe it was just a one-time thing. Maybe someone had gotten lost and was checking if anyone was home to ask for directions. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but then it happened again. I got home from work on a Thursday morning, and this time there were cigarette butts scattered around my front porch. They were a brand I didn't smoke, and they looked like they'd been recently extinguished. There were at least a dozen of them, suggesting someone had been there for hours. I was starting to feel genuinely afraid. Someone was clearly watching my house, probably timing my schedule since I've worked such regular hours. But I still had no idea who or why. That afternoon, I decided to stay awake instead of sleeping. I positioned myself in my living room with a view of the front yard and waited. Around 2 p.m., I saw a beat-up pickup truck slowly drive past my house. It slowed down significantly as it passed, and I could see the driver looking directly at my house. The truck continued down the street, but about 10 minutes later, it came back from the other direction, again slowing down as it passed. This happened 3 more times over the next hour. Wrote down the license plate number and called the police again. This time, they took it more seriously since I had a specific vehicle to report. They said they'd increase patrols in my neighborhood and run the plates. 2 days later, an officer called me back. The truck was registered to a man named Dennis Kowalski, who had been arrested multiple times for burglary and trespassing. It's more disturbing. He'd recently been released from prison after serving 3 years for breaking into occupied homes. The officer explained that Dennis likely thought my house was empty during the day. Since most people work regular hours, was probably casing it for a potential break-in, not realizing that I worked nights and was home during the day. They arrested Dennis at his apartment, and during the search, they found detailed handwritten notes about my house. He'd documented my work schedule, when I typically got home, what kind of car I drove, and even which rooms had lights on at different times. He'd been watching me for weeks. The most chilling part was that his notes indicated he was planning to break in the following Tuesday, which was only 4 days away. He'd written down that Tuesday was when I usually did grocery shopping after work, meaning the house would be empty for at least an hour. Dennis was charged with stalking and attempted burglary. During questioning, he admitted he had chosen my house because it looked like an easy target, being isolated and in an older neighborhood without many security systems. I moved out of that house within 2 weeks. Even though Dennis was in jail, I couldn't stand the thought of staying somewhere that someone had been watching and planning to violate. The idea that he'd been out there in the dark, taking notes about my life, studying my habits like I was some kind of lab rat, was too much to handle. I learned a hard lesson about home security that I'll never forget. Just because you live in a quiet neighborhood doesn't mean you're safe. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who take their time, who watch and wait and plan. If you ever notice signs that someone might be watching your home, don't ignore them. Cue stinks, because they might be the only thing standing between you and becoming a victim.